Thank you, Joe. I quite like the idea that I've been on some kind of intellectual odyssey. Well, thank you all for coming this evening, and I'd like to thank Tim and Jenni in advance. After all, I may not feel like thanking them after they've responded. Tim's sometimes been a trenchant critic of what might be called neurological reductionism, and Jenni writes brilliantly about the problems of modern democracy and society. So between them, they can demolish both the content and the form of my speech. The aim of these annual lectures is not simply for me to get things off my chest. If they were, I'd probably choose to talk about the ineptitude of the West Bromwich Albion front line, or why it is with 3 million unemployed people, Thames Water never has people working on its roadworks at evenings or weekends. Instead, the purpose is to explore the kind of issues which I believe the RSA should be focusing upon at least some of its energies. In my first annual lecture, I talked about pro-social behaviour, leaving Downing Street and being acutely aware of the problems of political leadership and social change. I explored the ways we must adapt if we're to fashion the future we say we want. I argued that to close what I called the social aspiration gap, tomorrow's citizens needed, in aggregate, to be more engaged, more self-reliant, and more other-regarding, or altruistic. In my second lecture, I focused on how our common sense idea of how it is we operate as human beings had been challenged by 30 years of research in neuroscience, behavioral economics, social psychology. This research, I argued, challenged three ways that we tend to think about ourselves. That we do what we do because we consciously choose to do it, that our actions are always rational and self-interested, and that there is a clear boundary between the self and the world that it occupies. Tonight, I want to try to bring those ideas together. In the main part of the speech, I overlay the idea of pro-social citizenship onto insights into human nature, and I explore three particular spaces for new thinking and practice. In my concluding remarks, I want to return to the themes of my recent article in Prospect magazine, asking whether our emerging account of human agency invites new perspectives on political ideology. Politics is also my starting point. The idea that there's something fundamentally wrong with our democracy has become a truism, especially in the wake of public outrage over MPs' expenses. When he came into office, Gordon Brown made restoring trust in politics one of his key goals, and even the keenest spin doctor would find it hard to describe this as mission fulfilled. But what really is it that's wrong with our system of democracy, and what is it that needs to be done? My observation begins with this, that democracy can only be as successful as we the people make it. But how well suited are we to being good Democrats? We've come over recent years to understand more about the idiosyncrasies of our mental processes. Now, some of these appear to compromise our ability to make wise and fair democratic judgments. Take a few. We are, for example, a bit confused about the medium and the long term. If people are asked to choose between £50 now and £100 in a year, most of us will take the 50 quid. But if we're asked to choose between £50 in 5 years and £100 in 6 years, which in a way is the same choice, we'll all choose the 100. We tend to be risk-averse, feeling more strongly about losing something we have than gaining something we don't. We get very confused by the relationship between absolute and relative quantity. For example, we'll travel across town to save £5 on a £20 shirt, but we wouldn't make the same journey to save £5 off a £100 coat. There are problems too with our objectivity. Naturally enough, we are much more inclined to understand the failings of those close to us than of strangers. We tend systematically to think our own successes are a result of our qualities, but our failures down to circumstance, and we think the precise opposite of other people. To take a trivial example, 90% of us report that we are above-average drivers. And there are problems with our judgment. We're not very good at predicting what will make us happy, and even more surprisingly, we're not even very good at describing what made us happy in the past. And in particular, we have a tendency to overstate the benefits we'll gain from buying and owning consumer goods. Now, we don't think like this because we're bad or because we're damaged. This is just how we have evolved. For the vast majority of our existence, for example, there wasn't really much need for us as hunter-gatherers to plan for the long term. So, short-term, innumerate, and self-centered. On the face of it, we don't look like we're particularly suited to being good democratic citizens. But of course, this isn't the whole story. Traditional accounts of human cognition are dualist. Plato spoke of a charioteer riding the two horses of reason and passion. Jonathan Haidt, in his wonderful book, The Happiness Hypothesis, replaces Plato's horse with the elephant of our automatic brain and its conscious rider. I'm with Freud in suggesting three elements. Think of human behavior as analogous to a mounted elephant walking through a forest. The elephant is the automatic part of our brain, the physiological and genetic predispositions we have as human beings. The rider is our conscious brain, the part that makes decisions and plans. The trees in the forest are the social context, blocking some routes, drawing us to others. The elephant may want to go a certain way, but the skillful rider can redirect it, while paths cleared in the forest encourage it down certain routes. But the drivers of human behavior aren't hard to describe just because they're complex. It's also because humans as a species are uniquely reflexive. We think about thinking. And that means we can adjust for our mental biases, just like the rider of an elephant might make allowances for its tendency to lean left or right. Which brings me back to democracy. Because surely democratic processes should involve overcoming the problems of applying prehistoric instinct to the complexities of the modern world. Instead, shouldn't it mean working together to make good decisions despite our limitations? This, I think, is where the core problem lies. Because instead of democracy being understood and arranged as a realm in which we think past our mental predispositions, it offers to be a sphere where we can pander to them. In his last campaign speech before the 1932 election, Roosevelt said, quote, "I believe that we're at the threshold of a fundamental change in our popular economic thought, that in the future we're going to think less about the producer and more about the consumer." Now, FDR was right. The redefinition of citizen as consumer has three distinct but mutually reinforcing dimensions. Consumerist politics requires that mainstream politicians promise to deliver rising disposable incomes year on year. Consumerism is also the dominant language around public service reform. But I think the third dimension may be the most problematic. And this is the way the democratic process itself has taken on the language, the norms, and the techniques of consumerism. The customer is always right is echoed in the motto of triangulated politics. The voter is always right. Or, as we should say in our electoral system, the voter in the marginal constituency is always right. Worcester woman is always right. The problem is, she isn't. As I've described, some of the reasons to suspect this have been provided by behavioral economics and social psychology. Confirmation is to be found in polls of public opinion. Take these findings. Most of us think more power should be devolved to the local level. An even bigger majority say that public service standards should be exactly the same everywhere. Patient satisfaction ratings for the NHS are higher now than they have ever been in the history of the NHS, but 56% of us think the health service is in crisis. We agree that we need to change our lives to counter global warming, but admit we have no plans to do so ourselves. In the phrase of Ben Page from Mori, the people of the UK demand Swedish welfare provision on American tax rates. Now, it's hard enough, I know, because I used to work in Downing Street, it's hard enough for politics to reconcile different interests and preferences in society. But now, a combination of the complexity of modern life and consumerist expectations mean that politicians face the challenge of reconciling conflicting interests and preferences in the same people. And generally, it's a challenge that they duck. We have an economy and a public sector mired in debt. We have ambitious carbon reduction targets, but no realistic account of how we're going to meet them. We are the fifth richest nation in the world, but suffer high levels of child poverty. All of this may be cited as evidence of how politicians have failed to face down the superficial and contradictory demands of voters. So, if we wanted people to see democracy as inherently about dilemmas and trade-offs, about balancing interests within people, within society, and across time, what are the kinds of things we might do? Here are some suggestions. First, devolve more power, because it's easier at the local level for people to relate to issues and see trade-offs, and to appreciate how their own behaviour shapes those trade-offs. Second, every year the government should hold at least 2 high-profile national citizens' juries on major policy questions, such as assisted suicide, drugs policy, how to allocate places to the best schools, in the best schools. These should be proper juries with their proceedings filmed and on the web, and with the government committed either to implementing the recommendations or explaining why not. And third, require all policy advice to ministers to be published in full. Believe me, if there was a policy out there that had only upside, it would have been implemented a very, very long time ago. Every policy has disadvantages, and it's about time politicians came clean about this. And because the mass media plays such an incredibly important role in encouraging unreasonable attitudes in the public, the advice should be released early to broadcasters, newspapers, and bloggers committed to a code of conduct on accurate reporting. Now, lest you're worried at my inconsistency, I freely admit that there are probably downsides to those 3 proposals. My point is this. The problem with our democracy is not, as we often think, about the performance of politicians, nor even the workings of our constitution, but it's about the content of the democratic conversation. Proper processes of democratic deliberation in which we either participate directly or which we can acknowledge as legitimate would help us to be less petulant, wiser, and more responsible taskmasters for our beleaguered representatives. And it would make democracy a place for learning, a place where instead of constantly impugning our opponents, we might find that rare and transcendent moment in political discourse when we come to agree what it is that we disagree about. A second area which could be informed by new insights into human nature is public service reform. The spending squeeze which we face over the next decade is an opportunity, indeed it's an imperative, radically to rethink. Now, regardless of their precise origins, we can think of public services as representing a common agreement that there are aspects of each other's lives and the overall fabric of society for which we share a common responsibility. But this ideal is too often lost behind the vast bureaucracy, the cloying traditions, the vested interests, the institutional boundaries, and the idiosyncratic public whims that govern the shape of our modern welfare state. So we end up with a health service which, like all health services, a fairly high proportion of treatment has absolutely no efficacy. A police service, most of whose activities are only marginally related to the things which actually make us behave well or keep us safe, and a school system in which the question of whether children are actually happy in school or enjoying learning is considered at best a side issue and at worst a distraction from the process of grinding out exam results. The question that underpins the new approach is this: how can public services turn themselves outwards so that instead of simply managing problems presented to them, they help prevent those problems and give people themselves the capacity to meet their own needs individually and collectively? How can the welfare state be as much about social productivity as social security? And here again, our strategy can be informed by insights into what makes us tick as social animals. Take the example of schools. Children spend roughly 20% of their waking hours in school. But we demand that schools achieve more and more and more in that time, not only higher standards for everybody, but other objectives, instilling citizenship, enjoyment of sport and culture, mitigating social inequality, even helping children find well-being. But research into how we learn shows that emotional receptivity is crucial. If the signal children get from the rest of their lives, the 80%, suggests to them that learning is irrelevant or that education isn't for people like them, they're very unlikely to succeed. If researchers describe a test in a way which implies that one group of students, say women or African Caribbean students, is likely to underperform, this leads to that group scoring significantly less well in the test than if they'd not heard the description. Any emotional disturbance undermines the capacity that we have to learn. A commitment to learning in communities and families is a more important variable than socioeconomic status in influencing educational outcomes. So teachers working in communities that lack commitment and confidence about learning are like factory workers trying to make a great product when they only control a fifth of the conveyor belt. But how would it be if schools started with a different question? How would it be if they started with the question, how can we use the amazing human, social, and capital resources of our school to help to instill a culture of learning in the community we serve? Now, we know it works. In desperation at failing to connect with a group of pupils, some schools have made a real effort to engage their parents and wider community, and when it's done boldly, the results can be amazing. Cabinet Minister Liam Byrne has, from this stage, cited the example of St Benedict's School in his constituency. The school had tried every method to address the systematic underperformance of Bangladeshi boys, but it was only when they engaged and taught the boys' parents that suddenly things shifted. The children started getting the same message at home as at school, and those boys were soon top of the class. But the responsibility for schools turning outwards to become a beacon for learning in their community cannot rest with schools alone. The RSA has been working with 3 secondaries in Manchester to develop what we call an area-based curriculum. The schools are supported by a facilitator who builds bridges with local institutions. The aim is to ground more of the pupils' learning and thinking about the city in which they live. So far, it's worked, engaging pupils and teachers alike. And our long-term aim is for the wider local community to own the school curriculum, helping to design it, to support it, and to deliver it, not just in school, but in everyday life. We hear a great deal about personalising public services, but what we need to think about is re-socialising them, using them to generate new capacity and stronger norms of engagement, self-reliance, and altruism. This, for example, is the aim of Southwark Circle, a new state-subsidised service in which older people pay a small membership fee to receive a combination of support and advice when and how they need it, plus access to social activities, much of it provided by community volunteers. In North London, Barnet Council wants to provide every person with complex needs their own life coach to help them to become more independent and access services. And these life coaches will not be traditional council employees, but drawn from the local community. Public service policymakers and managers and frontline staff need to get out of their institutions, loosen the chains of bureaucratic accountability, and use their considerable resources to shape the social context which frames the decisions we make about our health, our education, and our duties to our local community. And then there's a final area which I think looks promising as we apply insights on human behaviour to closing the social aspiration gap. And this relates to communities. Now, community is a tricky word. It combines imprecision with warmth, being so widely used and misused to have become almost meaningless. But despite the imprecision, there are some things we can say about it. Communities can shape attitudes, behaviours, and life chances. This claim is based in part on decades of research into social capital, but also into social norms. One example is a recent study of the residents of Binghamton in New York State. The researchers were looking for evidence of what they termed pro-social attitudes. One ingenious way in which they measured this was to drop addressed envelopes. I don't know if you remember what addressed envelopes are, but dropping addressed envelopes in the street and seeing what proportion got picked up and posted through the right door. The research team found that the key characteristic of those in the most pro-social neighbourhoods was not that they were rich or poor or any other objective social status, but simply that they individually felt they had good networks of support. The researchers argue that neurological, adaptive, and cultural processes reinforce each other so that the more you experience pro-social behaviour, the more likely you are to display it yourself. Communities may be complex and have fuzzy boundaries, but that doesn't mean they don't have definable and measurable characteristics. One way of seeing this is through the painstaking process of social network analysis, based on detailed maps of the relationships between members of the community and between this community and others. And through this, we can see that there are certain characteristics of social networks which make them more or less likely to be resilient. Networks are more resilient if they contain several hubs, by which I mean people or organizations connected to lots of other people and organizations. If one hub is lost because someone moves away or an organization closes down, there are others to take their place. Networks are also more resilient if there are diverse connections between the members. These help make each person less dependent on a few other people and also reduce the distance between people who are not directly connected. And third, both online and face-to-face networks are more resilient in the sense of being more open and adaptable if they have good links not only between people in the community, but between people and networks outside, what social capital theorists call bridging capital. Now, using these rules of thumb, researchers can draw up instructive social network maps, and this indeed is what the RSA is doing in its Connected Communities project, working with residents in New Cross in London and Knowle West in Bristol. And then social network maps can become a kind of self-diagnostic tool. Members of a community can see its core characteristics at a glance, More powerfully still, they can see how they might act to make their community more resilient. This could involve strengthening the links of people at the fringes, investing in organizations which have the potential to act as hubs, identifying missing bridges to the outside, and helping put those in place. Now, this may sound like a far-fetched or a kind of benignly intended but dangerous form of social engineering, but of course social network analysis is simply a more systematic and goal-oriented version of the online world now occupied by almost everyone under 30, and more of us well past that age. The reason this is important, not just to the community concerned, but to all of us, is that the social norms and networks around us condition our attitudes, behaviours, and life chances just as much, I contend, as our genetic predispositions, our conscious decisions, not to mention the exhortations made of us by 101 public agencies. As American scientists Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler say in their book Connected, social influence does not end with the people we know. If we affect our friends and they affect their friends, then our actions can potentially affect people we've never met. We discovered in our research that if your friend's friend's friend gained weight, you gained weight. We discovered that if your friend's friend's friend stopped smoking, you stopped smoking. And we discovered that if your friend's friend's friend became happy, you became happy. So these are some of the practical ways we might encourage people to be better citizens. But what could new thinking about human nature mean for our broader view of society? One of the most powerful concepts in modern sociology is that of reflexivity, developed and popularized by the author of The Third Way, Anthony Giddens. Putting it simply, this is the idea that modern citizens do not see themselves as mere objects of impersonal, religious, national, or class forces, but as subjects of their own lives, each with their own individual story. Giddens talks about moving from class politics to life politics. This, he contends, must enable citizens to work through issues at the intersection of personal life, stories, and social forces in the changing context of the 21st century. In the absence of the binds of tradition and deference, Giddens argues, we must rely on new democratic discourse to work through the challenges of modernity, promoting responsibility, new forms of solidarity, and trust in new social institutions. But there's a problem. And the problem is that reflexive individuals, their self-centeredness reinforced by free market ideology and consumerist mass marketing, can all too easily fail to see why they need these new forms of discourse. Can't they just do what they want and leave the rest to the hidden hand of the market or the hapless blundering of the political classes? So I believe both the case for a new collective spirit and the principles that could underpin the development of modern civic and democratic spaces are to be found in thinking about human nature. Cooperation and engagement are not things we ought to do, but a necessity to help us steer a course through the modern world using brains that evolved before the invention of the wheel. We became the social animals we are, subsisting in closed, homogeneous communities with deeply respected and very slowly evolving bodies of knowledge and culture, our first 200,000 years. We find ourselves now, the last 50 years, living as part of an economically abundant, diverse communities in a fast-changing global knowledge economy. This moment in human affairs has been characterized as the teenage years of the post-Enlightenment project, a period of change and creativity, but also self-indulgence, confusion, and some danger. As a schoolboy socialist in a 1970s direct grant grammar school, the first explicitly political arguments I ever had were about human nature. My vision of the good society rested on a view of people as fundamentally collaborative and benign, something only hidden by the depredations of what I called the system. Working-class Tory mates mocked my naivety. To them, we were all self-interested individuals. Those who succeeded did so by their own efforts. Those who failed or cheated would only change if they were incentivized or compelled. Yet, for most of the 20 years subsequently that I've been involved in politics, debates about human nature have been restricted to criminality and other social pathologies, as if only bad people failed to conform to the rational man model of neoclassical economics. Giddens was right. New times do require a rethinking of old political categories. New thinking about human nature, combining insights from natural science, social science, and philosophy, encourage us to revisit and recombine ideas from the left and the right. The left is right that society matters. None of the suggestions I've made in this speech will have much chance of succeeding in a society where inequality continues to grow. But the right is right to believe that growing self-reliance and thickening civic binds provides a more powerful, even if a slower and messier, route to social progress than the well-intentioned schemes of state bureaucracies. A new politics of human nature encourages us to accept the flaws in our intuitive sense of self, recognizing our psychological frailties and acknowledging the social nature of the brain. It requires us to see that the existential mirror of modernity is distorting. I have in the past described the contrast found in opinion poll after opinion poll between our undue personal optimism and our equally undue social pessimism. But the individual and personal is not quite the domain of self-control we imagine it to be. And if we are creative and ambitious, we can exert more influence over the social sphere than we've tended to think possible. A democracy that celebrates and embeds the need for compromise, trade-off, and responsibility. Public services with the freedom and the tools to enhance individual and social capacity. Communities working together to build their collective resilience. These are all aspects of what I would term social reflexivity, the process by which we acknowledge our social nature and work together to create the conditions for a better life. It may not be an easy route to the fulfillment of our amazing human potential, but is there really any other? And it's a route that I hope, through its lectures, through its research projects, and through the actions of our amazing fellows, the RSA will help to chart in the years ahead. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jenny, and thank you, Matthew. Yes, I'm cast in the role of one of Matthew's working-class Tory mates. I now have to spend the next 10 minutes mocking his naivety. I mean, as you may have noticed, I'm not working class. You may or may not know I'm not a Tory. And actually, frankly, Matthew, I'm not really one of your mates, although you never know. This evening may be the beginning of a beautiful relationship. Who knows? But to echo what Jenny said, I'm delighted to be invited to respond, and I'm hugely impressed because Matthew would have had absolutely no difficulty in finding a very, very clever, very eloquent person to stand up and tell you all how brilliant Matthew was. That would have been very easy for him to do. And Matthew and I have had a number of discussions over the past couple of years, and Matthew knows that I basically think he's wrong about quite a lot of what he says. And I think it's hugely impressive that he invites a known critic to respond rather than someone who's just going to support him. And that, I think, is very true to the values of the RSA, and it speaks to Matthew's desire not to be seen to be right, but simply to find out what the truth is. Anyway, I'm going to start by I'm going to start with some disagreement, but let me begin by agreeing. I do think that the new neuroscientific research, the psychological research in behavioral economics, it clearly is important. We're discovering remarkable things, and I don't think that anybody who's heard about these results and taken these results seriously sees the world in the same way after that. And I think it's going to change the way we view ourselves, it's going to change the way we do business, and it's going to change politics. So Matthew is absolutely right to focus attention on this. But now for the transcendent moment Matthew talked about, where we agree what we disagree about. And I think I really disagree on 2 points. I'm much more skeptical about the science than Matthew is. I'm much more skeptical about how much we really know yet. And I'm also more skeptical on the capacity of the state, government policy, government implementation to actually do much, even if we did know more about the brain. So let me expand on those 2 points. So disagreement on the science, it isn't that everything that Matthew told you is wrong. It's that the results that those of us with an interest in behavioral economics and neuroscience keep reading about, keep talking about, are constantly subject to revision. And sometimes not just fine detail, but reversal, straightforward reversal. And in many cases, we don't know quite why the results have been reversed or what's going on. I feel it's going to be a long time before we're really able to say with confidence that we know very much about how the brain works. Let me give you a couple of very quick examples. So one is this idea of the paradox of choice. Just been thinking about this today, so that's why I've settled on it. I don't want to consider too many options. You've probably heard of the paradox of choice. This is the idea that in classical economics, more choices can't possibly make you worse off. You could always choose the old choice, so new choices are giving you new options which you may or may not wish to take. No problem. Now, all of us, I think, feel slightly queasy about this. And research in psychology is starting to suggest that the more choices you offer people, the more difficult they find it to make the choice. They may even become repelled by the choices. They may refuse to choose. And when they do choose, they may be very unhappy with what they later chose. And I think this is the new conventional wisdom about choice. One classic example of an experiment that demonstrated this, but there are many others, was by Mark Lepper and Sheena Iyengar. It was published 10 years ago, just under 10 years ago. And what they did was set up a display of specialty jams to taste in an upscale Californian supermarket, which may or may not have been Whole Foods. So they set up these jams. When they set up 6 specialty jams to taste, they offered people a taste of the jam, then they gave them a little voucher, choose a jam, any jam. About 30% of people who had tasted the jams then chose a jam. When they repeated the experiment with a dazzling array of 24 jams, same thing, offer a taste, offer a voucher, see how many people buy jam. Instead of 30%, 3% of people chose to buy jam. This is this is a pretty large effect as far as social science is concerned. So this is very interesting. We don't choose the way economists thought we choose. It is a little puzzling when you look at how supermarkets behave, or Starbucks, who seem to be doing perfectly well despite their classic error of offering 87,000 different types of drink. By the way, that's not a rhetorical exaggeration. That is the real number, 87,000 different types of drink. Who knows why these guys are still in business after making a mistake like that, because we know people are repelled by the choice. So there's clearly something else going on. So a psychologist at the University of Basel, Benjamin Scheberhenner, decided he was going to try and work out when we suffered from the paradox of choice and when we didn't. So first thing he did, he set up the jams. It was a upscale supermarket in Berlin. 6 jams, 24 jams. Let's just do that experiment again, and then we can start manipulating it and find out when we do and don't find the effect. And there was no paradox of choice. Nothing happened. He just didn't see the same effect. He met up with the original authors of the jam study. They tried to figure out what was different about the studies. They couldn't think of anything different. One was in California, one was in Berlin. Maybe that's the difference. They couldn't work it out. He simply couldn't replicate it. He tried it again with chocolates, couldn't replicate it. Did it with CDs, couldn't replicate it. And then he gathered together all the research he could find on the paradox of choice, put it together in a big meta-analysis, and the average paradox of choice effect is 0. Sometimes we see it, sometimes we don't, sometimes we see the opposite, and we don't know why. So whenever somebody stands up and tells you we're learning amazing things about the brain, that's absolutely true. We are learning amazing things about the brain, but it's not quite clear exactly what we're learning yet or how to apply it. I could tell you other examples. I haven't got time, but I'm not dismissing all this research. I'm not saying it's nonsense. I'm not saying it's useless. I'm just saying so much of it is at such an early stage. We keep overturning things we thought we knew. We're not resurrecting the old rational economic man paradigm, but it's just not clear what we've erected in its place yet. And the second concern that I have is even once we are able to pronounce with confidence that we know how some particular mental function works or how people respond in certain situations, even once we understand that, it's not quite clear to me what the state can and should do about that. Simple example, I was talking to a thoughtful environmental economist last week, and he was telling me all about how much he enjoyed Nudge, and I enjoyed Nudge too. It's a great book. And the first example they give in Nudge is all about, it turns out you can get people to eat more healthily if when you rearrange the cafeteria, you put the salad first. So the first thing people see is the salad, and they tend to grab the salad, and then later they see the French fries and the hamburgers and so on, but well, I already got the salad, so okay, fine. So that turns out to be quite effective. He was saying the government should use this kind of nudging policy. The Conservatives are talking to Richard Thaler, one of the authors of Nudge, and that's all going to be great, and we're just going to be nudged, and it'll be wonderful. So I was sitting in a coffee bar with him about 200 yards away from where we now all sit. And I said, okay, great. So you think that this should be policy, the salads thing? And he said, yeah, it'd be great. We'd eat more healthily. Oh, great, okay. What is the law that you actually want to pass? He was gesturing behind him to the counter in this coffee bar about, yeah, and they could put the salads at the top. Like, there aren't any salads. It's a coffee bar. It's just brownies. There are no salads. So what do you want to do? Do you want to say, well, if you have salads, then you have to put the salads at the front, but otherwise you don't. What counts as the front? And what about the salads at McDonald's, which I'm told by Super Size Me, the salads at McDonald's have more calories and more fat than the hamburgers do, apparently. I didn't know that. Don't quote me, but, So do we have a further rule about low-fat salads? Well, probably not. Or what about, well, if you have salads, you have to put them at the front. Or what about if companies at that point decide, well, they don't make much money on salads, they're rather expensive, they're difficult to refrigerate. We can get away with the whole salad inspection if we just stop serving salads. And maybe now the result of the salads rule is that nobody serves salads anymore. You get the point. It's very easy to settle on an insight about how humans work. It's much harder to operationalize that insight in policy. It's not easy at all. And when I think about the examples that Matthew put in front of us, for instance, schools, and I can see, absolutely, he has a very good point. What children's educational achievement is so clearly determined by what goes on outside school. And there may well be something that a school can do to reach out to parents and to put that right and to help the children in ways other than what goes on in the classroom. But when I look at my own child's school, she's 5 years old, she goes to school in Hackney, and I look at what's going on with the school and I start thinking about the problems. So, yeah, it has a troubled catchment area and all of that, we know that, but they've run out of money for books. Is that because they were squeezed by the government or just because they can't add up? I don't know. The receptionists can't spell school. What do you do? The chairman of governors brings her children into school every day and they're always late and they're the only kids in the school not wearing uniform. I don't know, what do you do? We try and talk to them. It's hard to get them to talk back to us. They just had an Ofsted inspection. Everything was fine. They just failed on a couple of small items, which was the children aren't learning much and teaching's not very good. Apart from that, apart from that, actually things are good. My daughter's very happy. The school has a great atmosphere. They do try and reach out to disadvantaged minorities. They have great after-school clubs. They have a breakfast club. They've got there's lots right with the school, but actually there's also a great deal wrong, and this is after years of funding and years of implementation and trying to make things work better. So when I hear Matthew say, it's so narrow, just the idea of just focusing on the school and just teaching kids in the school, it's so narrow, we need to be broader. Well, yes, I sympathize with that. And yet, even the basic task of getting the teachers to teach the children in a sensible way with the right school books and talk to the parents about what's going on, even the narrowest, most reductive definition of what a school should be doing, schools still find it difficult to do even that. And of course they do. It's a very hard problem. It's clearly not easy. And in summary, I was reminded by Matthew's speech of my time in the aid industry. I used to work for the World Bank. And the aid industry has gone through, I think, the same intellectual journey that Jenni described Matthew going through. So first, Matthew said, oh, it's fine, as long as the right class is in charge, everything will be fine. Well, the aid industry as well, as long as the colonial powers are in charge, everything will be fine. And then we decided that wasn't very good. So Matthew and the aid industry then moved on to, well, we need the right policy. Then they both moved on to implementation, and then on to social analysis and networks. And the aims that the aid industry now set itself are incredibly broad. You can look at the Millennium Development Goals. There's everything from gender equality to dealing with AIDS, human rights, governance, corruption, just absolutely vast target that the aid industry has set itself. And I think Matthew has set himself a similarly, or he set all of us, not just set himself, he set all of us a similarly ambitious target. And I really don't know how to respond to that, because on the one hand, I sympathize with the idea that this narrow, delivery-based approach isn't enough. It's not enough in the aid industry, it's not enough for the NHS, it's not enough in our schools. And yet, when even the narrow implementation is so hard to deliver on its own terms, it's so hard to get even that right, I worry that as we broaden our horizons and we talk about not just educating the class, but educating the entire community, are we simply setting ourselves up for something that just cannot be done? So I think we've achieved the transcendent moment of disagreement. I think that Matthew is wrong. I think he set himself the wrong target. But if that's true, that's fine. You know, people are wrong in policy all the time, in politics all the time. We have a discussion, that's okay. I'm much more worried about the fact that maybe I'm wrong and Matthew's right. Because if Matthew's right, we really do have a mountain to climb. Thanks very much.